My name is Michael Ben. I'm the founder of the Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy groups. And the groups are really a project to try and get psychoanalytic thinking more available to the public through social media. So we're setting up talks with important psychoanalytic thinkers and interviews around important contributions. One of the important contributions is the book Lacan and Race, Racism, Identity, and Psychoanalytic Theory. This is our second interview with the authors. The first was with Derek Cook and Sheldon George and was a very lively discussion. And that will be made available on YouTube. And we'll share the link during the talk. The talk with Todd McGowan was postponed, but we'll reschedule for mid-October. And today for our second talk, I'd like to welcome Professor Hilary Neroni and Gautam Basu Thakur as our guests. Both are accomplished professors who have made important contributions in Lacanian thinking and around race and identity. Hilary wrote the chapter in the book called Confederate Signifiers in Vermont, Fetish Objects and Racist Enjoyment. She is Professor of Film and Television Studies at the University of Vermont, and she is the author of Feminist Film Theory, Cléo from 5 to 7, The Subject of Torture, The Violent Woman, and has also published numerous essays on culture, media, and psychoanalysis. Gautam wrote the chapter in the book Fanon Zone of Nonbeing, Blackness and the Politics of the Real. He is Associate Professor of English and the Director of the Critical Theory at Boise State University. He is author of Postcolonial Theory and Avatar, Postcolonial Lack, Identity, Culture, Surplus, and is co-editor of Lacan and Nonbeing and Reading Lacan Seminar 7 on Transference. The interview will be conducted by two of the psychoanalytic group's moderators, Inda de Burka and Andrew Fairmont-Smith. And they have both contributed a great deal, spreading many important Lacanian ideas on the group, and along with helping applying them to social ideas such as race and identity. So just a quick note before we start that for us from South Africa today, it's Heritage Day, which is an important day here in South Africa. And with that in mind, I've found this week with reading the chapters that it's very much been on my mind, a lot of the ideas that are in these chapters and how important they are for us here in terms of in a post-apartheid South Africa. But anyway, enough from me. I'll pass you on to Enda and Andrew, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So let me just say hello, everyone, and thanks for being with us here. And I want to thank Hilary and Gautam for joining us on this. And both these folks have written really two very remarkable essays, which are in the new book, as Mike mentioned. And the book in general, I've said this in the previous video that you can see on YouTube now, the first meeting that we had with Sheldon George and Derek Hook. The book as a whole is a really very incisive and powerful way to reflect and think on how race and racism works. And in many ways, for many people, I think is still a very new way of working with psychoanalytic, particularly Lacanian psychoanalytic work and analytic work in how to think about race and racism. And it not only that, but deploys a certain kind of analysis that, in my view, opens up a lot of political implications and is very, I think, fortuitous. One of the things that I think is particularly striking is that it really allows for a way to start to think about the persistence of race and racism. It sort of helps to, I'll just speak broadly here, to get beyond a certain way of thinking that tends to think of racism as a matter of scapegoating. And that is certainly a part of it, but I think Lacanian psychoanalysis allows, or Lacanian psychoanalytic thinking allows for a deeper way of thinking about how enjoyment around the racialized body, or the image of the racialized body, is engaged structurally in a certain investment that culturally we're still at a very beginning point to really understand that, I would say, broadly speaking, in Americans, just speaking about American society. And I just wanted to bring that up as something that, you know, this is for a broad audience, not necessarily certainly probably not very Lacanianly deeply, or rather, I mean to say, an audience that has a lot of knowledge of Lacanian terminology. But nonetheless, we don't certainly don't want to dumb things down. And one of the things that I appreciate a lot about both of your essays is that you don't do that. At the same time, there are certain points where there is sometimes a tendency, not in your essays, but generally in how we work with Lacanian terminology, that sometimes things get a little, in my opinion, watered down. For example, the term enjoyment. For example, sometimes can be confusing for American audience because enjoyment in the Lacanian sensibility is not a matter of, say, enjoying going to a baseball game. It's a little bit more complex. It has to do with pleasure and pain. And I just want to bring that up because I think as we discuss some of the, you know, things that you've both in your essays are excellent. I think we have to keep in mind that our audience is not necessarily familiar with a lot of Lacanian. I'm sure both of you as teachers are aware, but I want to bring this out to the general audience, that some of the terminology is a little bit, you know, unusual, but some of the things really need, you know, to be clarified. So in saying all that, I think we could start here with talking, if you don't mind, if it's okay, Hilary, if we start with talking about your essay, which was very interesting, I think, on the Confederate signifiers in Vermont. And if I could sort of start the ball rolling, I was wondering, and I'll ask you to explain a bit about it, is what really prompted you to, it's a very interesting essay about the sort of historical, on one level, process of how these Confederate monuments developed there, which is very strange for most people to really understand, like why this happened, and the date timeline of it, and then the kind of whole battle around removing them, and the attachment to the rebel imagery and all of this that you address. I'm wondering, you know, just to bear in mind how particularly psychoanalytic analysis differs from what we've seen in some of the CRT type of critical analysis of the Confederate signifiers in American culture today. So it's a sort of a general question to keep in mind.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for staging these interviews and for having us on. And of course, thanks to Sheldon George and Derek Hook for not only putting the book together, but being so wonderful about getting the word out and really making it a project that goes beyond just the publication of the edited collection. So I'm really impressed and grateful to them. And yes, that's a really interesting question. And, you know, one of the things that this was the first time actually I really wrote on something that happened that I was a part of. And that was an interesting experience for me. I'm usually writing on film and film and culture. So I do write on culture from a psychoanalytic point of view. But this was so intriguing to me as I watched it unfold. And it had obviously was linked to or participated in what was happening around the United States. And so it was intriguing to me to think about, you know, what exactly was happening. And one of the things that I found to be particularly important is the way that the emotions ran so high with the debates about the monuments, Confederate monuments and mascots, and the removal of the Confederate flag in certain places as well. So after witnessing this kind of local battle, which was a battle about removing the name of the school, which was a nickname of the high school, which the mascot, and the middle school and so forth, which was the Rebels. So it was a mascot called the Rebels. And this is not uncommon. So what I discovered in doing research is that, in fact, there are something like 60 schools around the United States, if not more, who have the mascot, the Rebels, and they're oftentimes they came along with an image of a Confederate soldier that over time often was rebranded and rebranded and rebranded so that it would look less and less like a Confederate soldier, you know. In fact, our school, by the time we were trying to, or really the whole push was from the students who worked to get the name removed. By the time that happened, there was no even mascot anymore, just the colors of blue and gray, the sort of representation of what the original colors were. So what was intriguing to me was the real emotional response that happened around this signifier of rebel. And so I was intrigued to, you know, one of the things that came up a lot was that the people who were against removing the name really voiced that they felt that that all the enjoyment they had around that name was being sullied, you know, was going to be kind of ripped away. And there was a lot of debates about the signifier of the word rebel. So within the school board meetings, there were these very heated debates with like 100 people there about what the word rebel meant, right? And so I was really intrigued by, you know, the way that this signifier had taken on so much meaning. And what I was trying to look into is, and you touched on this, Andrew, in the way that you were introducing us, is that I wanted to look into the way that that signifier was structured into the fabric of American society. And rather than just do a historical look at it, which I also do in the essay, but is to think about where does enjoyment and desire, where do these psychological responses, how are they positioned around this signifier, and then what role did the signifier play? So in doing research, what I found was that, as most people know, and I don't know how international or we are, I'm imagining we're very international in this meeting. So, but just a little background, the Confederate monuments and the use of the Confederate flag and the adoption of Confederate mascots in the US happened really in two waves in the United States, and they happened after the Civil War. What's weird is usually you would think of it that these monuments would be torn down. Like usually when there's a battle over how the society should be structured, the monuments that represent the losing side get torn down after the war is over, right? That's usually a kind of symbolic gesture. But in this case, after the Civil War was over, there in several waves, there was waves of putting up Confederate monuments and sales of the Confederate flag booming, and it usually happened right during the Jim Crow laws, so in the 1900 to 1920s, and also during the 1950s and the 1960s. So a lot of scholars have noted that that kind of symbolic gesture of putting up these monuments and flying the Confederate flag at these moments are moments when, in fact, the law of the land in the US is saying we are dismantling this structure of racism in our society, and we are putting out laws to prevent discrimination. So at moments when the US in general was trying to take down the structures of racism in the society, to change it, etc., these are the moments that these monuments come in waves across the landscape of the United States. And interestingly, the high school here in South Burlington, Vermont, was named the Rebels in 1961 at that time, as was all of these other schools around the United States. And I did a lot of research into the local newspaper and stuff to see what people were saying at that time. And for example, when asked about why they made that choice, why did they choose the Rebels at that moment in 1961, one of the graduates said, well, we did it because we wanted it to have an emotional impact. And so, and also just to make note, we're up in Vermont, we're very, very far north. So it doesn't really make sense, right?
Right, I know, that's one of the things that's really remarkable about it. And not only, I mean, I don't think maybe a lot of Europeans don't know that, but Vermont is mountainous region, quite north. And yeah, anyway, so it has really no relationship to Southern culture at all.
At all.
Yeah.
So that's, it's bizarre in that way. And so I tried to do this linkage to see, well, what does that mean? We chose a signifier that was really emotional. And then what people say is, it's not tied to slavery or racism, it's just emotional. And so my investigation was to try to understand what happened there on the level of the psychological attachment. And what my overall argument is that these objects, the monuments, the mascots, the Confederate flag, they come in different intensities, and then they remain in certain ways throughout history. Are in psychoanalytic language, I felt that they were operating as fetishistic objects, where they have a kind of rigid way of preventing any sense of lack and creating a sense of wholeness. And that's often what people would talk about, is they would say, like, you're wrecking my whole past if you take away this object. And they would deny any knowledge that the object had anything to do with slavery. But in fact, historically, if you look through all the local papers and everything, there's plenty of evidence that it was quite clear, you know, what's going on in the South, and what these mascots and monuments actually meant, right? And even in South Burlington, what's interesting is when the high school was named the Rebels, publicly in the newspaper, there were some public scandals about Black military people not being denied housing in South Burlington right at that moment. And there was a law put out saying you can't deny housing. So there was an attempt to create more equality. And that's when the high school was named the Rebels. And now, of course, there's no more Confederate imagery. But at first, they flew the Confederate flag at sports games, and they had Dixie, the name, and they had a Confederate soldier that went out there. So it really was the whole kind of imagery. So my psychoanalytic reading of that is that those moments when this wave of the monuments come in are times when the symbolic rules of the land, in a sense, are being completely changed by the law in an attempt to make the society more equal, right? But in doing that, it reveals to people that their identity was shored up by this symbolic idea that they no longer have access to. And there's this real sense of lack and loss. And they fill that, right, with these symbols that still tie them to slavery, right? But of course, it's not a conscious decision. It's an unconscious emotional response. And then, of course, also those objects become really powerful. And it's all about this emotion without any kind of analytical discourse, of course, that goes with it, that there is no analytical discourse surrounding those objects.
That's the interesting part in a way to me, that it's a strange thing to, because the initial thing is very, which I don't know if you get so much into in this, I don't remember, but that it's asserting a very like big other symbolic at first, when the statues, etc., and the imagery is at first put in, it's really clear when we look in hindsight in your research and in other folks' research, that it's really very physical, symbolic, assertion in public space of against new progressive political movements, etc., for equality, Black equality, etc. And then there's a clear block that's being articulated and declaring a certain big other hegemonic, atmosphere of like, this will not be allowed. It's very clear in a certain sense. I think we can theorize that in an almost Deleuzian way of deterritorialization and such, almost very physical. But then when you have it watered down, as you mentioned, about the rebel outfits, like the imagery is not, I'll say, politically correct or whatever, it's not acceptable anymore.
Right.
So over like a decade, it gets weeded down. It's no longer even visually recognizable, except for, as you mentioned, the colors are the same. It's a gray, blue, you can map out that goes back to the original colors.
Yeah.
And it still has the name Rebel. So all that's being held together is, we're in the kind of, in a Lacanian terms, like we're in the real here, in the sense of like the signifier, in the sense of like, if we talk about using, old kind of terminology here, imaginary, symbolic, real. If we say the American flag, a version would be in the symbolic, and then the real version would be a shredded version. We can barely read that flag is readable. It's just like this shredded thing in our hands. So all I'm driving at is that at the later point that you're talking about your analysis, the rebel colors are barely readable anymore, is tied to the original Civil War reference. Yet, what I think is so interesting here is that there's still this attachment to its meaning, but they consciously will argue that it doesn't have a relationship to this. And in a way, which I think is interesting, there's a sort of, how can I put this, like a built-in, like sort of legitimate, because it doesn't have a direct link. You are kind of interpreting, you are almost being a assertive Freudian to insist that, hey, no, it still has a relationship to slavery. But the big, no, it doesn't. It barely has any relationship. It's just gray and blue colors now at this point, and rebel can mean anything. That's how they'll argue counterpoint. You guys are just all woke. You're just doing woke stuff you're making us feel guilty all the time. Stop doing that. That's what they'll counter argue. Say, we're outside of history. It's a kind of positivist argument. But what I think is interesting is then how still does one critique that, because in a way there's some truth to it, that it has watered down to be barely readable. It is just the gray and blue that is ambiguous at this point. And so it's still a very interesting thing about how history is moving, so to speak, dialectically, that it becomes now just this weird, barely there thing that yet people remain. That's where I think is very interesting, in the sense of how would we theorize that attachment? You're analyzing in terms of fetishistic disavowal, but isn't it also a kind of objet, like they're involved in some kind of demand that this is still real, like I care about this blue and gray color rebel thing. It's like I identify with it. It's so important for our community. It's a sort of open question for me how that still functions when it's so watered down, and they will accept that it is watered down, and they'll use that fetishistic disavowal as an argument.
And I think I was interested in trying to get at that and to understand it. And psychoanalytically, my feeling was in the end that the reason it was important to dislodge that object is because the object was creating this rigid placeholder, right, that was preventing any kind of moving forward. And so even though it had lost some of the original imagery, right? Even though there was no longer the Confederate flag being waved like there had originally been, and there was no longer singing Dixie or the mascot and so forth, the emotional enjoyment, right, which is linked all the way back through these different waves of the monuments and even back into slavery, right? That emotional connection is creating this sort of rigid placeholder, which, you know, fetishistic disavowal, right? You take that object and you stop up, you're attempting to stop up any sense of lack, right? And to imagine yourself whole, right? And so dislodging that makes you feel this sense of lack, but then it also, though, would allow kind of desire to find a new landscape and try to reshape things, right? So keeping that object in place like that, in that rigid way, continues all these repetitions of emotion and of the way that enjoyment functions, and doesn't allow for the community in this sense to move forward and try to find a different way and to create a new way to think about, you know, creating structures of equality and kind of having more of a proliferation of desire rather than a locked in kind of fetishistic disavowal. And one thing I analyze at the end of the chapter is what happened in this local battle, which is that the school board, because of the students' activism, did decide to remove the mascot, even after there was a lot of resistance to it from a group that eventually formed and created themselves on Facebook called the Rebel Alliance, and which in itself deserves its own analysis. But so the school board eventually voted it off, and they voted on a new mascot. The students chose a wolf, and they now have a new mascot. But then the school tried to pass its budget, and it failed because the next mode of activism on this opposition's group was to vote no on the school board budget as a kind of symbolic gesture. And so one thing I analyze at the end of the chapter is these lawn signs. We had like thousands of lawn signs as a reaction in this political local battle, and the side of keeping the name Rebel, who already lost the mascot during the school board battles, which happened just a month or two later, they had all these printed out signs that were everywhere, just everywhere you drove, they were everywhere. And they said, be a rebel, vote no on the school budget, because it was like keeping, and it's sort of another example of, it doesn't seem to be the same issue, but they're keeping the same emotional investment in a different symbolic issue to tie it back and rigidly contain, right, and try to resist this removal of this fetishistic object, right? But the group that was for removing the name, they so the vote no, be a rebel, vote no was a printed out sign. The group that was for removing it created all these homemade signs, like kids drew them and they had balloons on them, and they had like drawn wolves and they said howl for yes, and they had like kids holding balloons and say yes to the school budget. And it was like, and at one point the rebel group for the rebel name went around and stole all the signs from the vote yes group, and like went in the middle of the night with a truck. Someone even saw them, and then it was like reported on Facebook and all this stuff. So in response, the group trying to get the budget passed and who was for removing the name had all these pop up like create more signs, and they would all draw more signs and put up all these signs. So one way I analyzed that is that removing that signifier allowed for this like new landscape of desire, where these communities were coming together and trying to create new objects that were in the service of equality, rather than in the service of preserving this nostalgic sense of wholeness that was wrapped around traditions of originally slavery and, Jim Crow laws and all of these things. Interestingly, besides the little pop-up sign making groups, that there were also groups of people, usually adults, who were getting together spontaneously just to talk about race and racism in the community, to share what they saw, to try to figure out how to change things, to admit feelings they had. And it was truly spontaneous, and in response to this dislodging of this symbolic moniker. So in some ways, I think that that dislodging of it is what allowed for a kind of new landscape of desire, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. Cool.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask Hilary. Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by the replacement from of the object. What kind of new objects could you describe as taking place?
So in that initial phase, I would say it was just all those handmade drawn signs.
Wow, beautiful.
All this kind of like expression of creativity. They were artful. Some of them were like written out ideas, others of them were just, very colorful. And so they were they were spontaneous, creative responses in a way. So maybe somewhat more ephemeral, but I would say more aligned with desire rather than aligned with fetishistic disavowal in that sense.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and I was also wondering in terms of like desire, we can see that shift in desire, but what about in relationship to enjoyment? Yeah, because there is a difference, isn't there? So I was just wondering the replacement, and does it really get to the depth of like jouissance, for example? So yeah, I think that's a good question.
And I do think there was all this jouissance around that mascot and that name and that enjoyment. And if we would look at like, well, what's the pleasure and pain? Because if that's how we understand enjoyment, to not be pleasure, but rather to be this pleasure and pain, I think that that combination was involved in the in that rigid response to this fear of lack, right? And when that was dislodged symbolically in the community, the proliferation of instead desire, right? Which was more ephemeral, more changing, more of a landscape, which, was evolving in a sense of struggle. And, now we have to kind of roll up our sleeves and work on this community and that kind of thing, as opposed to enjoyment, which I think had with it just a lot of extreme emotion and attachment, which had this kind of sense of rigidity, and that's where the enjoyment was what was gluing the object in, what was what was the the
interesting paradox that I think people don't, or link that people don't usually associate, that enjoyment can have this fixated fetishistic object linked to this almost obsessional enjoyment logic within the social link. So in a way, what you're talking about is that in this particular historical sequence, there was this kind of breakup at this, you're talking about creative energy of writing new signs that in a way helped to break down that fetishistic object.
Yes. I think that's what happened. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Well, listen, we're going to need to move to the to talk to Gautam, and I want to go back to, we're going to have a question and answer section open to all, and with questions to you as well, I'm sure, if that's okay.
Great.
And, okay, terrific. And thank you. That was really interesting. And we'll come back to it. Yeah. So Edna, do you want to talk, introduce with Gautam, or I could? It doesn't. It's either. It's fine.
You can go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. All right. Sure. Okay. So let's see. On Fanon's, Gautam has written this very interesting chapter on Fanon's work, Frantz Fanon's, which is very important work in the 50s and 60s. Very important for a lot of revolutionary work and combining, for people that are not familiar with his work. So I'm going to assume that most people who are here today are familiar with his work. But I think what's so strong about this essay, and I really think people should read this, it's a really terrific, which is Fanon's Zone of Non-Being, Blackness in the Politics of the Real, is really the way he's bringing forward a really new way of thinking that, okay, I'm just going to speak very directly on this, is that there's been a lot of academic scholarship on Fanon that, in my opinion, separates and tries to sort of make Fanon, let's say, acceptable for a liberal academic environment. So that often means like taking out the more uncomfortable, let's say, elements of the violence, the way that he talks about violence in some of his texts, and the way in which he talks about the internalization of racism among people of color, different issues that are sometimes very uncomfortable to read and to deal with. But Fanon has always been a very, I'll put it in regular terminology, straight shooter, let's say. So he's very clear, analytical kind of analysis. And he's there. What's also very good about this essay, and something to discuss, is how you read him against the grain of his existential humanism, which I think is a difficult thing to deal with. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure that entirely the way you've written this gets all the way there, because there's a lot more to deal with that problem. It's a difficult problem with Fanon's work, because he so much goes back and forth between this existential humanism and psychoanalytic thinking. So I was just rereading, sorry, as a side note, the book that you referred to, the whole introduction, because you refer to that one paragraph in your essay. And so I wanted to read furthermore. And indeed, the whole writing is very sort of poetic almost at points. And it sort of tethers between psychoanalytic thinking, revolutionary thinking, of Marxist influenced, and existential humanism, which is really a very difficult discourse, actually, the more that you try to break it down. Anyway, I've said too much already. I would, if you could take it from here and explain to this audience a little bit about what this work is really, your essay has started to help us to think about Fanon's work and how it's dealing with the real, the particularly complicated position of the, as you call it, the non-being, of which is, there's so many different things here we can discuss. So I'm going to stop talking because there's a lot really you've opened up here. So please, if you could, take the.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for organizing this. Thanks to Sheldon and Derek for giving me the opportunity of publishing this chapter in their book, and also for organizing these kind of promotional events, which just gives me more opportunity to come and share my thoughts, talk a bit more, and also unlearn what I have written. I think the point that Andrew made initially, I'm going to run with that for the moment, which is Fanon is a very uncomfortable thinker. And it's not just because of the way he talks about violence, it's also because of the way he moves between psychoanalysis, humanism, Marxism. It's also because of the style of writing. And I think when reading Black Skin, White Masks, I chanced upon those two sentences that appear in the introduction. I felt uncomfortable not being able to make sense. And I know that has been the problem of many people reading Fanon. What does he mean? What does he want? What is he trying to say? Because nowhere else in Black Skin, White Mask does he talk about the zone of non-being. In fact, the word non-being is only used twice, in the 5th chapter, and I think after that in the 6th chapter, but not in the way the word is used in connection to a zone in those two sentences. So I decided to kind of explore that discomfort with that particular, passage. And what started off as a curiosity kind of soon took hold over me, and I felt like I needed to unpack this. But there wasn't much coming from Fanon in support of how to explain this. So that's where I decided to bring in the postcolonial strategy of rereading or misreading. Gayatri Spivak calls it funky reading. Edward Said calls it contrapuntal reading. Slavoj Žižek says it's in reading short-circuiting. So trying to short-circuit Fanon, not only with Lacan and psychoanalysis, but also with postcolonial studies. Also with, it might not be as apparent in this piece, but also with the kind of queer studies that we find in the writings of Lee Edelman. So putting those things in adjacence, I was trying to kind of excavate what is inside those two sentences. And this is what I found. I mean, if I can just go through those two sentences, he starts with an affirmation, there is, and then immediately moves to a negation, there is a zone of non-being. And he continues describing that non-being or the zone as sterile and arid. And if we look at these words, or as I look at these words, I do a close reading as a student of literature. Sterile, or in some translations barren, is actually suggesting the impossibility of reproduction. That's where, again, Lee Edelman comes in. And arid is suggesting a lack of satiation. There's no satisfaction here. And then it followed, at least in the Markham translation, with the which goes as, it's an inclined stripped bare of every essential. So it also has no possibility of essence. So it's a complete state of negativity, yet it is that state of negativity from where a new departure can emerge. So starting with the affirmation of there is this negativity, ending with the possibility of a new emergence. And this is the new emergence, which is very important for Fanon, because in spite of being as poetic as he might be in his thinking about decolonization and the subject condition of the colonized in Black Skin, White Mask, he is always thinking about what is to be done. What is the way out of here, right? And he does that in obviously Wretched of the Earth, which comes after. So I found that it's very interesting that if we read this two-sentence paragraph in terms of Fanon talking about the need for the colonized to enter this, what he calls a real hell, for the purposes of a new emergence of the colonized, I asked myself, then what does that mean? And what I try to do in this essay, as I said, by scavenging, by excavating, and obviously I'm not finding full skeletons, I'm not finding fully preserved archaeological site, I'm finding only bits and pieces. I'm finding like these two sentences which almost come from nothingness, hinting at the infinity, to use Fanon's words, to build a theorization of Fanon, which I think is appropriate for not only understanding how the early Fanon of Black Skin, White Mask lines up with the later Fanon of Wretched of the Earth, but also how psychoanalysis helps us to reread Fanon and what Fanon brings to psychoanalysis. And thirdly, of course, for the purposes of understanding our present global condition of existence. So what this essay tries to do, therefore, is talk about how, unlike most scholarship, Fanon identifies the colonized as existing between an identity that is impossible to attain, white, and an identity that does not exist, black. Because as Fanon says time and again, there's no authentic black identity. Now, most often in post-colonial studies, we will see that we talk about how did the colonized get its identity, what are the discourses used by the colonizer, what are the problems, what are the mechanisms of material exploitation emerging from that, how can the colonized subvert that or hybridize the identity. But I think Fanon is making a radical departure by saying neither of those two identities actually exist. In fact, both are imaginary, and the colonized is burdened with living in between, except it does not realize that it's living in between, spending its life either to be authentically Black or chasing after the identity of the colonizer, let's say white, which will never be possible. So the solution, it seems for me, that Fanon is suggesting is for the colonized to embrace this negativity, this zone of non-being, and become the positive iteration of what David Marriott calls a non-negated negativity.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I find it useful thinking with thinkers like Gautam Spivak or Lee Edelman, or what Lee Edelman, when distinguishing between queerness and queer as identity, calls queerness or queer as identity as the positive ontologized figuration of queerness, which is deontologized negativity. So I think the colonized, by emerging as this positive figuration of what is essentially, this is the problem with words, I'm saying essentially, but it's not an essential condition, is status of non-being. What it can manifest is this disturbance within the symbolic, from where we have a kind of new emergence that's possible. In fact, I think what Fanon is doing is going almost against the entire tradition of Western epistemology, which identifies negation or negativity or non-being with no, with non-life, with the absence of creativity. Whereas he is saying creativity, or new creativity, is only possible through this no, non-negation. So he takes the no as a yes, and wants to move forward from there to see what is to be done. And that's where I kind of try and end my essay on two things. One, by suggesting how, therefore, Blackness versus Black as identity, Blackness as this positivization of negativity, is kind of close to Lacanian real, or as he calls it in Letter D, the absence. Which is both present yet absent. It's both the impediment yet the galvanizing glue for the symbolic. And then finally look at what it means to think of this negativity in relation to the violence or the emergence of the new man that Fanon comes up with in Wretched of the Earth. Because I find Wretched of the Earth to be kind of different from Black Skin, White Mask. And even though it's kind of the more preferred go-to text for Fanon right now, even with post-colonialists, I think there's a lot to be learned from Black Skin, White Masks, unlike what some scholars of Fanon have said, that post-colonialists need more than Black Skin, White Masks. I think we need Black Skin, White Masks, but we need to have a more rigorous poetic engagement, creative engagement with Black Skin, White Masks, in order to really unpack the relevance of Fanon.
I also wonder, I mean, I'm not a scholar in Fanon, but so I could be completely ignorant right now. I just wonder how much there's been a real analysis of within the Pan-African movements, the dialogue, sort of a dialogistic analysis of the kind of, debates and discussions that were going on, how much he was in a kind of arguments going on. Sort of, I'm trying to make an analogy to Lenin's type of texts, which are so rich with these kind of complicated arguments going on. That's why they're almost sometimes unreadable now. You can't read a lot of Lenin's old essays without knowing what the hell he's even talking about. So Fanon writes in this, as we know, as we were mentioning earlier, in this different styles that does transcend the immediate moment. That's part of his existential humanism. So it doesn't read like some of Lenin's obscure essays where you don't know what he's referring to at all, because he's right in the throes of a real literal argument about something. But my theory would be that indeed Fanon is involved in all kinds of arguments, that would be something that I think is somewhat missing now. It's just my instinct that there isn't a real, like, let's contextualize in 1955, what happened, you know, exactly what's going on when he is thinking this and that at this time, when he's putting out this thesis, what is being argued and what's happening right then and there. Let's take him out, in my view, of the thrust of existential humanism a bit. I'm not saying like wipe it out, because that's a part of his language, and a part of a common language of that time, which also gets me to something else, which is there's a certain thing here, and you might, I'm sure, familiar, but in Genet, which I've been recently studying a bit, there's a very similar issue of dialectic, non-dialectic, that the way he portrays the working class particularly in the play The Maids, and in his own writing about his own experience as a thief, you know, he was basically like a, you know, an orphan, and he lived as a thief, and his life as a young man was a very tough, rough, gay, oppressed young man in Paris and other parts of France. And he's not sentimentalist at all about any of it, but he definitely drives to something quite similar. He's very influenced by this existential humanism and has a very similar issue of being not in the dialectic of the bourgeois order, and what that then yields of being shit, of being the real, of being outside, and in a way looking in, like Alice in Wonderland, Alice in the Looking Glass, in a way. And it just hit me the other day, because I've been working on that play for a different project, and it just hit me like, wow, that's a very, I wonder if it's in particularly 1950s, the influence of Sartre to some extent, of course, but not a matter of, you know, hermeneutic influence, more a matter of how important that question was to face, like the ones that were outside of the dialectic, and how Fanon, because you bring that up, I think you note that just very briefly for a moment in your essay, the way in which that the non-zone is also outside of the standard dialectic. What I wanted to ask you about that is, like, okay, this is a little bit of a forced Hegelian question. Is it really possible to be outside of truly a dialectic? Isn't the non-dialectic still in a dialectic? So we would have to understand what that dialectic is. So if you know what I mean, like
I think the point I'm making is that the zone of non-being is not strictly speaking outside. It's more like the inside outside. Mm-hmm. And that is why I was doing that close reading of the two sentences, which I actually don't do in the essay. I wish I had done it, because that's why it starts with a there is. So he is saying there is the zone of non-being, except it is not there unless you try and take that descent down the paths of hell. So I think throughout the essay, what I've been trying to say is this zone of non-being is the inside outside. That's what I'm saying. It's not entirely outside. It's the inside outside, except for the fact that the dialectic, by framing the terms of operation as white and black, you are black, you want to be white, or you want to be truly white, or the dialectic of the self versus a negated other, which consolidates the self, it overlooks how there remains something already inside out, something that is in excess or a remainder, which, if it stages a return, would kind of problematize the symbolic order. And I think among the post-colonial writers or thinkers, Homi Bhabha is the one who has come closest to talking about this notion of how the stereotype, disturbs the discourse of the colonizer by returning this excess, because the constitution of the other as stereotype always creates an excess which cannot be symbolized, but which obviously I think also comes from Bhabha, because he's a very careful reader of which comes from Fanon, because Bhabha is a careful reader of Fanon. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make, that this, if it was completely outside, that would have been a different game, and we could go into questions of whether it's at all possible or not. or whether that outside coming in can be easily symbolized as some sort of threat from the outside that must be stymied and offset and stuff like that. But if it is something that's already inside that starts acting out, what does that mean? And in my reading, I have been trying to use Gayatri Spivak's theory of the subaltern as something that's both inside and outside, something that has a position in society but without identity, as something in order to help me think through of what this zone of non-being's inside outsideness can mean.
Yeah. Anna, do you have a question?
Hi. I just want to ask you. Unmute myself. Okay. Gautam, you said something in your essay in relationship to the Nonhuman. I think the emergence of the Nonhuman for me is very interesting part of the essay, of your essay, obviously of Fanon as well. But the Nonhuman disrupts the principle of exchange. So the Nonhuman disrupts the principle of exchange that is foundational to the colonial regime. I just think in terms of symbolic exchange and what we're talking about, the real in relationship to the fantasy, I find this very, very interesting. Because, and this goes back to my questioning of Hilary as well, really, you know, rather than just replacing symbols with another symbol in terms of desire, but so we still more or less remain within the fantasy with the changing of the symbols. So I think with the idea that the Nonhuman disrupts the principle itself of exchange that is foundational to the colonial regime. So obviously this has a relationship to Marx and capital in terms of exchange and the exploitation of the colonized and the exploitation of labor. So I just was wondering whether you could say something about the relationship of Marx to Fanon, just in that elaboration of the Nonhuman disrupts the principles of exchange.
Hilary, do you want me to go first, or did you want to take the question? Okay. So, you know, the emergence of the Nonhuman is through the self-depreciating violence of traversing the depths of the zone of non-being. It is what that kind of purges it of the signifiers inscribed on it by the colonizer, that you are Black or you are only half the subject we are. Or as it happened in the case of India with the introduction of English language, which aimed to create a group of men who are English in taste and culture, but Indian by blood and color. And the idea was eventually, having learned to appreciate English culture and taste, they would become their own sovereigns. But of course, this eventuality was always deferred. It was never going to happen without the cut of decolonization. So I think the couple of things that I wanted to touch upon here very briefly in terms of what does disrupting an exchange means. It means, it means, as I said, to be purged of the self, to enter into a confrontation, in the words of Steve Biko, but not first with the colonizer, but with your own self. The colonized enters a confrontation with their own selves, what they have become, seeking either that whiteness or seeking that authentic Blackness. And I think Fanon charts that in his chapters, couple of chapters in Black Skin, White Masks too. And following that, when the new man, the new colonized can emerge without the baggage of, let's say, the desires or the phantasmatic objects that it believes can give it wholeness. Let's say full rights as a white person or a citizen of the British Empire, right? I'm talking about the Indian colonial context. When those things are ruptured because the new man does not, fall in that cycle of desire. So that's one, there's a disruption of desire. And I think when we speak of colonialism, though we often and almost always focus on the material, historical, and the political contexts, which are very, very important. But we also have to think of what it means in terms of the ontologies of the colonizer and the colonized. Right? And the second is, of course, then the new man will also disrupt the logic of economy, which is absolutely crucial, which is, I think, what Gandhi tried to do with all his self-reliant movements, and pardon me saying this, misguided as they were, in my humble opinion. But that was the issue of rupturing the economy. So hitting the new man's rupturing comes at the level of the ontological, as well as at the level of the practical in disrupting the economy, which is the reason why colonialism is happening. It's a violent territorial occupation for exploitation of labor, human labor, and natural resources. So if we can disrupt that cycle as well, along with the disruption of what the colonized wants you to be or what the colonized wants you to think yourself as, I think that's where a kind of I don't know whether that's where the moment of liberation lies, but that's where a kind of disruption and disturbance emerges, and which is problematic for the colonizer, because it kind of leads them to ask, what do you want, without any response. So do you not want ontological fulfillment? Do you not want to become rich and successful like us? Right? And Gayatri Spivak, in a similar yet different context, calls it the crisis of the ontophenomenological, when the big other or its representatives, the officials of the state, encounters the radical alterity of the other and fails to symbolize it within grand narratives of being and becoming, both in terms of desire as well as, let's say, the market.
Thank you. So I think this brings to my mind that this place of not crossover, but becoming one, almost like the concrete universal, that race in this way is the concrete universal of class antagonism, in a sense, in a Marxist sense. I don't know what you think of that, Gautam. But
yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. Could very well be. I mean, it's definitely a universal, not of positive identities, but negative identities.
Yeah.
That's definitely, I think, yes, I would agree with that. Yeah.
And isn't that Fanon's sort of, let's say, original action, is to deploy it as here's where we get a little bit close to Lacanian logic of that he's calling for traversing the fantasy when he's, in a sense, when he's calling for, or entering subjective destitution, when he's calling for this notion of who can enter this hell, this poetic reference, which, I'm not an expert in Fanon, but I don't know how much, in a way, his whole writing has a kind of quality of asking the reader to enter into this hell in a certain way, with it carefully, but he's not afraid to bring you into some rather difficult areas. But anyway, that's a whole other question of how his rhetoric works, is really where I was just thinking on the top of my head. But
so I was wondering as well, Gautam, in terms of the new man attempting to reinstate the body as pure negativity back into the symbolic. And I was thinking a little bit about Stuart Hall's ideas of representation, of getting some representation in the symbolic, and how, in a sense, disappointingly, I think, that this was latched on to by Tony Blairite politics in the UK, in terms of, they had this idea of Cool Britannia, an idea that we could get as many Black artists as possible to be represented. But I think, in a sense, although that's obviously that's all fantastic work, but on some level you might lose that notion of the pure negation or negativity, because you're staying within the fantasy parameters of the neoliberal structuring. So, and I think that's what I was getting at, sorry, with Hilary as well, in relationship to replacing new symbols, but staying within the fantasy structure.
Go ahead, Hilary.
Okay, I didn't know. The Zoom flow of conversation, it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, a crossover between our papers and investigations of, you know, and I think one way to think about it is that not all objects are the same, right? And they're not the same because of the cultural and historical moment. So our process, our psychoanalytic understanding of the way the psyche works, you know, our responses, of course, we can analyze the structure of our responses, but of course the material is always going to be different depending on what's happening in the culture and in the structures of the society at the moment. And so I think that objects become powerful when they are involved in exactly what Gautam was talking about in terms of that fantasy of wholeness, right? And there's so many, of course, instances of this, right? And it's about, I think, disrupting that fantasy of wholeness that has a potential then for a moment of change. And I think it's important to think about the way that the structures of society, of course, and the way that we interact with the symbolic terrain, it's not rigid. It's not going to stay exactly the same. So we can't just say, never this object, always this object, never this, right? Like there can't be, or let's always exchange this for this and everything will be fine, right? It's always about the struggle of understanding what's gonna work toward, you know, allowing us to work toward equality and create the most freedom for everybody at once, right? And a lot of times I think the way that understanding that allows us to see the contours or to begin to analyze those fantasies of wholeness and what's holding them together, and then how to disrupt them to allow more of a landscape of acknowledgement of lack and acknowledgement of the antagonisms within the social structure, and that out of that lack can come creative responses. But if we don't open that up, the creative responses which might lead toward more equality and more freedom aren't going to happen, right? So again, you don't want it to lead to another reign of rigid objects. It's not about, finding the right objects. It's about recognizing when that fantasy of wholeness is operating and trying to constantly open up spaces for actual, creative responses and attempts to realize more an authentic response for creativity. And I think that those objects that hold up those fantasies of wholeness, they become rigid and they need to be dislodged. But I see your question or your leading point about, if we're just replacing one object with another, is it really going to do anything? And I think it's more about opening those spaces and recognizing that there's not, there shouldn't be one rigid object. We're not going to then say, this is it. now we're all going to only have this object, right? So, but I think it's recognizing that fantasy of wholeness, and it's specific to every different situation, whether you're talking about colonialism or you're talking about racism in America and the way that played out in, as I am in my paper, in these cultural objects and so on. I don't know if that answered your question.
Wait, it's me. Yeah, no, that was very, I think it gets to a few, I mean, of course it'd be very different in certain situations because Vermont is largely, it's very white. It's largely, it has a very progressive, more or less, relatively speaking, is my understanding, social political environment within New England as well. It's nonetheless largely capitalist. It's a liberal capitalist. You know, it's not, though it has certain elements relative to America socialism, but I would never say that it's exactly socialist in any traditional sense. There's no movement there to nationalize, you know, the healthcare in any dramatic sense or anything like that. But in any case, there is a kind of New England ethos of democracy and this kind of thing there that I would imagine is rather, you know, well and strong, and so people are more open to talking one-to-one about political issues, and it's not you know, there's repression in every society, but it's a different kind of repression than you might find in places that are very strictly maintaining strong, you know, oppression within the system. And so, I mean, that goes without saying really here. So it's a very different thing. So that's where it gets to where I'm getting to is like, it would be, I certainly would imagine that in other circumstances, it's very difficult to sort of dissolve these fetish, you know, types of structures around symbols. They would become even more intensely attached. Like, for example, in Holland right now, in Belgium, there is this, what is it called? There's this particular thing that children do where they do blackface on Christmas time. And it's a Dutch thing, or Flanders thing, exactly. And I don't know where it stands now in the cultural debate, but there was a big cultural debate about it. And a lot of people were very defensive about it, that it's not to be identified as blackface, in the way that critique of that minstrel imagery in American culture has been largely criticized and is basically been, you know, tried to be, removed from American culture as much as possible. But there is a movement, as last I understood, still resisting, very similar to what you're talking about in Vermont with the rebel thing, but really pushing back against saying it's not blackface, it's not that, it's a different thing. It's anyway, I just mentioned because in some regards, the way in which the society in parts of Northern Europe are is quite racialized in certain ways, which are at the same time unconscious about. So they're somewhat disavowed, and it's not something that's necessarily openly discussed, ironically enough.
Hilary, it's about, you know, in South Africa, we're going through a very similar sort of process. And I thought it was so interesting when you, in the chapter, described how there was this wordplay around things, and almost sort of going back to definitions that sort of lose the actual painful parts of certain words. And we've had the similar thing here where initially some words that were very painful, very racist, and people would defend them by sort of giving a definition of what they originally were, and saying, but, you know, this word means this. So it's a sort of more comment that we still are going through a very similar process, and, you know, with a lot of street names that are named after sort of apartheid leaders, and it's a difficult process because there are a lot of the symbols, like for instance, our Springbok rugby emblem, which is sort of linked to, I suppose, the all-white Springbok team, but it's also loved because So I suppose the sport that is quite successful in our country. So it's difficult because it's got those links, but that sort of continues. So it's just more a comment that of how things get defended and how actually painful, I think, letting go of certain and how contentious letting go of some of these symbols are.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what's also painful, besides the work that those symbols are doing, in other words, the way that they're tied to a legacy of a disavowal of the violence of racism, right? And the way that that disavowal, the way that it works is it attaches a enjoyment, right, as this fetishistic object as a placeholder, and kind of keeps it in place, right? So when you start trying to dislodge that, what's also difficult is the conversation. Like, having that conversation is, I think, itself the tearing open. And I think that, at least in the US right now, we're all experiencing the difficulty of having conversation about the important aspects of how we want our society structured, and how do you create equality, and what's the best way to structure society in which everyone is free, right, and has opportunity and is free of oppression. Those conversations are really right now very difficult. And so I think dislodging those objects is important because it opens that conversation and asks people to struggle with their own relationship to the object, to their society, to each other, right? And that struggle is one where some of those symbolic fictions of that wholeness, of that fantasy of whole,ness, are going to fall away, and it leaves you staring into this abyss, of the lack of subjectivity and of the antagonisms in society. And that's a difficult moment, and it's a moment that, like, everybody has to rise up to and try to really struggle with and move toward. Of course, everyone's goals are not the same, but I think that that's partly the difficulty of that moment, is that it's not like that moment can just happen and then we all move on. Well, then you actually have to think of what you're going to do and how you're going to relate. And it's a lot of struggle. I mean, it's just like when we think about being in analysis, right? And you have those moments of realization where things fall away and you have to look at yourself. And it's a very difficult moment. So the courage of what happens after that, I think, is really the part of the key,
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for that. That kind of really answers my question as well from before, because I think that dislodging of the object is so important. And the way you describe it now reminds me very much of what happens in the clinic in terms of subjective destitution. Right?
Yeah.
So this is a destitution of the subject, so that it doesn't become this kind of object chasing the desire of the other within those fantasy parameters. Yeah. So I think that's where the race identity operates, on the level of the jouissance, on the level of the drive. So, and it takes us around to this idea that when we're thinking of Fanon, and he's talking about the new man emerging, that this is not just the colonized as the new man, but that the colonizer as well. So whiteness is racialized. It just, as much as blackness is. So that object of dismantling, and the object that has to be dismantled in order for the subjective destitution to occur, this has to happen with the colonizer as well as the colonized. And I think sometimes that's left out of the discourse. Yeah, is that we can replace objects and we can symbolically desire something new, but unless we somehow leave that symbolic parameter, that we're just bound to, the same in the clinic, we're just bound to repeat the symptom. So Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. You're saying it's about the courage. What comes after that, and that is the kind of hell. The hell is the subject of destitution, isn't it? And the courage is then, well, what exactly happens after that? How do we not allow the negation fall into a kind of a positive attribute again? Because it's so easy to allow that to happen. I'm actually writing a little bit on neurodiversity at the moment, and it seems very different, but there is a relationship there. Is that the difference in the neurodiverse person, as soon as it becomes a positive attribute, and there's this championing of liberation through opposition to a neurotypical, you're actually caught up in the parameters of the normalizing structuring again. So I just think, just as a metaphor, I think that seems to be happening quite now. As the binary signifier that is normally repressed, as that is not holding so much in terms of constructing and holding us in terms of fantasy. I think right across neurodiversity, but I think this also relates to obviously sexuality and to race as well. I think more and more younger generations are not the response to a certain failing of the binary signifier, which the signifier that would be repressed, is that we can stay with that negativity for a while, rather than have a new object straight away to have an ego ideal. And the ego ideal, then, as Freud has described, is with the pathology of group identification. So again, I think this is something really important, where what you were talking about, Gautam, about the new man emerging.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, I don't think I had the space to enter the discussion of the consequences of the emergence of the new man. The consequences are not just for the colonized, the oppressed, it's equally for the colonizer or the one in the position of the subject supposed to know, or the master. And what the emergence does as that moment where, as pure negativity, it manifests the fundamental condition of all speaking subjects as lacking subjects, is to horizontalize the hierarchy of the colonial space. And very interestingly, I think in the longer project that I'm hoping to do, I would be using some of the British imperial writers like Rudyard Kipling and George Orwell. Orwell not as imperialist and misogynist as Kipling, but still, who actually make this point. For example, George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, where the colonial officer is almost caught in the gaze of the oppressed and has to perform his role as a white, courageous officer. And that moment he realizes the gap between him and the role he is performing. Repeats a number of times through Kipling. We see this very well documented in a number of texts that I'm looking at from South Asia, from India in my Bengali language, but also in like Gile Pontecorvo's film Quemada, or Burn. At the end of it, we see that moment happening. So I think I definitely agree that that's the aim, but I also remain, tad worried about how long this moment can run without us falling back into the symbolic dialectic of desiring, fantasizing, and because the political space, in a certain sense, as I read it, is kind of based on the fantasies of phallic wholeness and a corresponding anxiety over loss. And I think Todd McGowan has written excellently about this in a number of places. And that also plays into the whole idea of, renaming streets or pulling down statues. For example, in India, a lot of cities have now been renamed. So they have been, the old names, the colonial names have been changed to some sort of pre-colonial name, as if that gives us a sense of wholeness, right? So that promises wholeness. On the other hand, a renaming can also play on the concerns of a subject. For instance, in my city, Calcutta, the street in front of the US Embassy was overnight renamed by the then Communist Party as Ho Chi Minh Road. And this was right after the Vietnam War, right? So if any letter addressed to the US Embassy has to be so-and-so Ho Chi Minh Road, right? So we see that happening continuously, right? Or for instance, in the context of South Africa, I know all the topic that you're talking about name change and this and that, but there's also a big discussion about Gandhi, about whether his statues should be on college campuses for unfortunate statements he had made. So I think it's a very interesting thing, but as I said, I remain worried about how long can this continue, because it's not enough just to change, the hierarchy, but to completely rethink the way we desire.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to desire lack instead of some sort of wholeness?
Mm-hmm.
To remain in the lack without striving after that wholeness. I'm not sure. I obviously don't know what data is there in clinics and that side of the things. But given my archive, I think we are primarily where I am at, looking at some momentary fleeting rupture of creativity, which retains the possibility of a new future.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether that can be sustained.
I mean, the problem, of course, there's a bigger question that we don't really have time to get into, would be, of course, the problem of sort of romanticizing or fetishizing transgression as such,
Yes.
But in any case, I think let's move to, there's a number of questions here. I think, Alexandra, you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you so
please.
much. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. It's so interesting. What are you talking about? I would like to put a question. Is this about extimacy as being the most intimate interior of the split subject and experienced as being the radical alterity? Because this concept of extimacy brings exactly, it's my feeling, what you are talking about. So this fear, this angoisse, this anxiety of some radical alterity. And if it's about that, I would like to ask you, what do you think maybe contemplation as a Christian experience, traditional Christian experience, or meditation as Buddhist experience, maybe all these traditions can help the subject, the split subject, to get acquainted to this gap, to this nothingness. We know that in Christianity we have this apophatism, this experience of God as nothing, as nothingness. What do you think about that? Because I think if the subject, if the split subject is too identified, then it's so difficult to have this in between, this as somebody said, this experience of the lack, of nothingness, of indeterminate. So I think it's about anxiety here, and maybe contemplation, meditation, or maybe other practices could help. What do you think? Thank you.
I'm thinking that's questions for me, right? Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's an excellent question, and I'm not acquainted either with the Christian tradition or with the Buddhist tradition to be able to either speak from some sort of reading knowledge or even personal experience. But I do think the point you're making is interesting, because it might be, and this is perhaps in all traditions, being on a path where you can be at peace with yourself, and that yourself, whether it's a self of plenitude or whether it's a fragmentary self, either way, you have to be one with yourself. You know, even within Buddhism, which is different traditions, I think Tibetan Buddhism very similarly begins with a know of nothingness than anything else. Early Vedic writings also talks about the nothingness that exists from which everything is created, and so forth and so on. But what I think Fanon is trying to do is, I think he's trying to recapture not a moment of peaceful engagement with this self, which is more than the self, in excess of the self, but I think he is more driving towards how, at the moment of this encounter with your split self, what overcomes you, at least at the initial moment, is a cause of concern, of fear, of anxiety. Like, for example, Freud on the train, when the door swings open, he sees his own face in the image. He's like, oh, who is that grumpy old man looking at me? I am scared, right? I think because in Fanon, his humanism is more of an anti-humanism. His philosophy is more of an anti-philosophy, in the sense he is not willing to commit to a direct correspondence between truth and knowledge, that there can be a truth in knowledge or a knowledge about the truth. Everything is in that flux, in that moment of consternation, because I think he believes in that consternation, in that prohibition, in that negation is the possibility of a new creation. And this is where I would return him to his immediate historic context, to which I cannot relate. I mean, even though I am 2 generations removed from colonial India, I still cannot relate to that. But I think given that urgency, which in today's day and age can be translated as the urgency of I cannot breathe, we cannot be simply thinking about some sort of peaceful resolution to our split, fragmented, abused identities and entities. We need something more practical, something where we have to find a resolution. And in a certain sense, with his work in the clinic, I think we see that as he moves towards more practical solutions than, let's say, the prolonged clinical analytical solution. He wants to know, how can someone get his head cleared of lice? He's not interested in sitting down and talking about his unconscious or her unconscious. Similarly, decolonization, as I understand, if I can, from just reading that period, both in my context of my country and Fanon's and others, is not something to have. It must be had now, in this moment. And this is, again, the difference between, you know, gradual reform and the cut of an immediate change. And that's where I think Fanon comes in with his theory of violence. We're not going to sit and wait, plead and prod the big other for eventually giving us freedom. We are going to make it happen now. I'm not going to wait for my grandchildren to get freedom. I want freedom for myself. Right? Exactly. So I think that's where Fanon is coming from. I don't think he has anything, or I have anything against, you know, the other aspects of finding a more harmonious perspective of life and being. But I think for the radical need of decolonization, of being treated as equals, I think Fanon makes that argument, and I'm just kind of trying to describe and chart that argument for sure. But thank you, that was very, very excellent question. Thank you so much.
I just want to say, I think that the nothingness is slightly different in Lacan and in existentialism, that idea of nothingness, and also in Buddhism. So I think really like what Fanon and Lacan are getting at, either in the clinic or in a critique of colonialism, they're not looking for some kind of space that denies antagonism. So it's about doing something with the very nature of antagonism itself that cannot be denied. But actually, your truth is antagonism. There's only the fantasy that puts that space that somewhere there is a harmony, relaxed self. In fact, there is no self in psychoanalysis. There is the subject, but the subject is very different. Yeah?
Okay, I think we have a question from Payal Ray. I think you have a question. I'm not sure for who, but Payal, are you there?
Hello.
Hello, hi.
Hello. I have a question for Gautam Basu Thakur, and my question is very basic questions about psychoanalysis. Many academics say that psychoanalysis is a myth and it's not a scientific argument, and many say that it will be finished in some few years. So, what is your take on that?
Oh, thank you so much. And I think many of us can or would want to respond to that question. I'm pretty sure Hilary would also want to say something. I mean, yeah, I mean, we keep, this is almost like this problem with psychoanalysis is almost like, you know, the apocalyptic imaginations that the world's going to end in 2 years, when it doesn't happen, maybe 2 years after. So we have been hearing that psychoanalysis will go away since the 1890s. It somehow hasn't gone away. However, that does not mean there is a need to decolonize psychoanalysis or to occupy psychoanalysis or to, and that's a process. We see both Freud and Lacan, there are 3 stages, as we say in Lacan, there are 3 stages in Freud. They keep going back and reimagining, reviving, and moving forward. Even Freud's great friend, Einstein, decided that Freud should not get the Nobel Prize in medicine because it's unscientific, it does not work. But I would also like to say that let's agree that psychoanalysis is unscientific. But then that means it's best poised to address the question of humans who are unscientific. Because we're the only creatures who act against our self-interest. So we need an unscientific theory for something or someone who is completely unscientific. Is psychoanalysis a myth? As Barth would say, dehistoricized and depoliticized speech? To a certain extent, that can be critiqued because Freudian psychoanalysis is very much rooted in history, starting with his studies in hysteria. So we need to return history. We need to return context and local, you know, cadences to psychoanalysis. But whether psychoanalysis will go away in a week or 2 years or sometime, well, I guess only time can say. But for now, it has sustained and sustained beyond some of other major thinkers and theories have sustained.
Yes, but it was because there was not the progress of neuroscience that time in 1980s. But now the tool they have discovered with all that tool, neuroscientists have discovered so many things which psychoanalysis did not. What is your take on that?
Hilary, you want to take that part? Or
I mean, I would say, of course, you know, neuroscience, thank goodness for any of the benefits that we get from all the discoveries in neuroscience. But as Gautam so well put, we all still seem to be constantly acting against our interests and need to figure out how to live in this world, right? And I cannot see a time that we need more, that a time more than now that we need psychoanalysis so much right now with what is happening around the world, right? This incredible emotion, massive sense of fear and anxiety, right? A real kind of sense of our societies kind of coming to this point of conflict and on the brink of, you know, not knowing what's going to happen to the structure of a lot of our societies. So I think that understanding all that emotion and that fear and that anxiety, while certainly we can talk about the way our brains are, you know, biologically working, as Gautam said, it doesn't help us when we're talking about how do we deal with that emotionally on a day-to-day level. We need also this other aspect. I would just say that they work, you know, in the same world, you know, that neuroscience does what it does and we need it, of course, but we still need psychoanalysis to be able to understand why we do what we do and why we act against our self-interest. I mean, I think that's one of those main things that when you think about this question of how do we respond to lack and antagonism, and I really appreciate your point about that that's not this, maybe not the same thing, although I have some very interesting and fabulous friends who say that maybe they're very close, the nothingness of psychoanalysis and Buddhism, but nonetheless, like that antagonism is something that we will always have, and that gets played out in our relationship to signifiers, in our relationship to the process of you know, the interrelation between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, and our own individual experience of that. You know, there's never just one experience of antagonism or nothingness, right? It's always the play within the symbolic and your own ability to struggle with that, right? So I think that, yeah, I thought I saw your comment on the side, and I thought that I think Gautam's right. We're always getting the prediction that psychoanalysis is going to disappear, and yet we're still here. But I think the reason is because the you know, human psyche and the experience of being human is still feels like, the experience still feels like a mystery that really needs to be investigated. And the way that ideology works in society, I think, the way that it presents itself is to constantly make that not a mystery, right? To constantly create this sense of wholeness and a fantasy of meaning which is anchored in some sort of rigid plan. And so we get told again and again that we need to respond in a certain way, and none of us feel that way, right? So this question of how to analyze what's happening, I think we need psychoanalysis more now than ever. And so I think if I were betting, I would bet it's not going away, but that would just be my bet.
Okay, we're running a little tight on time, but I want to.
Can I ask another question?
No, we have other people, Cléo, that have questions. Okay,
Okay.
But thank you. It's a really good question, but we have other people that need to ask questions also. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So Prabal, I think you have a question as well.
Yeah, am I audible?
Okay, great, terrific.
Yeah, so Lacan talks about the literature of the real, or literature as he calls it, in Seminar 17 and also in Ecrits. That is the literature of the real, in reference to the dissolution of language in James Joyce, as well as the missing signifier in the case of the Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe, and also Beckett's Endgame. So I was wondering if is it possible to redefine the psychoanalytical coordinates of this concept to understand and read post-colonial literature as literature of the real. So that was my question.
Hilary? Should I go? Okay. Prabal, I think, again, another excellent question. And I do not have an immediate answer, even though I know you have been possibly seeking some sort of an answer to this question, because I saw the question at the first event we had with Sheldon and Derek. I don't know whether we were able to reach to that. I had to leave because I had a class. I guess a couple of things here. I mean, one is, if I have to start thinking about this question in order to arrive at a thesis or hypothesis, I think I would first ask, what is post-colonial literature? I mean, there's not one single post-colonial literature. and post-colonial literature in the sense of, are we talking as a post-colonial as a temporal reference, something that happened after decolonization, or are we talking of post-colonial as an ideological referent, that is literature that goes against the colonial regime, so it could have happened during the colonial writing, right? So if you're thinking of Rabindranath Tagore's Khorebaire, for that matter, it can be considered post-colonial as it goes against some of the main things that's happening in the colonial regime. So that's one in what is post-colonial literature. And obviously, what post-colonial literature are we talking about? Are we talking about Anglophone? Are we talking about Lusophone? Are we talking about Francophone? Because different colonial regimes put the colonized through different kinds of experiences. I mean, I can hardly imagine what the people in Belgian Congo would come up with as post-colonial literature after suffering the regime of Leopold, right? Whose policy was chop their arms off, and after they have finished their labor, chop their other arms off, doesn't matter. So it did produce Heart of Darkness. It did end up in Apocalypse Now. But what is post-colonial literature? Where is it coming from? Who is it writing? In what tradition? Is it in the vernacular, or is it in the colonizer's language? The second thing I would definitely want to consider would be, when we talk about post-colonial as literature of the real, are we talking about the imaginary real or the symbolic real, or real as you rightly said, Lacan talks about in context of Joyce or others like that. So going on those things, in the sense, post-colonial literature as showcasing, illustrating the real of colonialism, let's say as Heart of Darkness does, or post-colonial literature as unraveling how radical antagonism structures colonial relations of both the colonizer and the colonized. And I think what comes to my mind right now of that in-betweenness, of being stuck in that antagonism and no way out, it's Sadat Hassan Manto's, some of his stories, especially, see, I'm blanking out now, Toba Texing, of being caught in between. Again, not strictly after the colonization ended during partition. So in that sense, I would say this is a very excellent question, which can be pursued and which can even be established as an interesting hypothesis. But these fundamental introductory prefatory questions must be fleshed out, and then there must be textual evidence in support of how are we arguing the case for post-colonial literature as being literature of the real. Right? I'm not even getting into establishing the connections between Lacanian theory and post-colonial, but that will be another challenge, of course. But again, this is a very interesting question. And, I think lots of projects can come out of this. And this is definitely another way why psychoanalysis and post-colonial remains, even though the death of both disciplines have been announced so many times.
Mm.
Thank you so much.
Okay, hi.
Sorry, Andrew, could I just address Prabal just for a second, Prabal? I think it's worth noting that Lacan writes an essay on James Joyce, and he does a whole seminar on Joyce, basically. But basically, and this is to illustrate the structure of psychosis, yeah? So that there is something in the letter, in the actual writing, which resists this symbolic structuring. And this is very specific to Joyce's writing. And I'm not going to go into this too much politically, but I do think that even that in itself, we have to understand where Joyce is coming from, because Joyce comes from Ireland, yeah? So Ireland is probably the first colony. So there is a post-colonial element in what Joyce is trying to escape through the almost like a strangling language, yeah, which was imposed upon the Irish, because Irish didn't speak English before the 19th century. Yeah? So we can read this enjoyment of the letter in Joyce. You can read that as a way of escaping the colonized symbolic parameters of the English language. Joyce finds a way to allow himself a way to live by actually escaping the particular but the particular colonial superstructure, the colonial symbolic parameters, which he was confined by. So even though that doesn't seem like there's any dramatic sort of political event, but nonetheless, we can read something very, very subversive in relationship to what background Joyce is coming from, what led him to this release of a certain mode of enjoyment in the language. So,
it's a very interesting.
I just wanted
point.
to say one quick thing. Sorry, Andrew. Just wanted to say one quick thing following on Enda. Joyce is possibly not the first Irishman to do this. Jonathan Swift, before that, he has been also talking about how to get rid of words, right?
Yeah.
Not even his polemical writings about feeding children and stuff. So there is always that thing that forget the words, can we survive without words? Yeah, very interesting point that you made there, yes.
Now, listen, we have more, maybe we can do more questions within the Facebook post of this YouTube post of this conversation, but we are really tight on time now. So I'm wondering if Hilary and Gautam, if you would like to have some last comments, and then Mike, if you could also, I guess we'll proceed that way. Maybe Gautam and Hilary, if you have any last thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Just, I guess if I were to sum up what my essay was trying to tackle, would be that looking at these debates in our current debates over street names and monuments and mascots and so forth really sheds light onto and opens up space within psychoanalysis, or psychoanalysis opens up space to talk about the way that the social fabric can be defined by the community's response to lack, and that confronting the role of the fetish object can cause great uncertainty, but it also creates this potential for a new terrain, maybe of desire, which would be beyond the spell of sort of racist enjoyment. And I think that psychoanalysis really allows us to open up some of these areas that haven't been discussed about racism in the United States and why it's enduring in the way that it is. And so I'm grateful to you all for allowing us the opportunity to talk about this. And again, grateful to Derek Cook and Sheldon George for opening this conversation so thoroughly.
So yes, I am grateful to all of you for giving us this opportunity. And as I said, to Sheldon and George, to even include my piece, and I think I was having a conversation with them and I said, critical theory is like barbecue. It's an imperfect art. Even the best pit masters don't know whether they'll be able to produce the good stuff that they produced some time back. And I wanted it to be that way because I think that kind of works very well with black skin, white masks, which at one level is also an imperfect art. It's also very raw around the edges and stuff. But if I was trying to do anything with this essay is to first bring in the perspective of the other, the colonized, the black, in conversations about how racism works. Right? And second, I was wanting to underline what I considered to be Fanon's most interesting or significant contribution, at least at the level of black skin, white masks, which is he wants us to examine colonialism not simply as a question of economic and political inequalities, but also in terms of the ontological. And Fanon, as I said a while earlier, that means both the colonizer and the colonized. And what it does for someone like me with my background in postcolonial studies, I think it allows us also to reconsider the focus that we have in postcolonial studies about rescuing and rehabilitating victim identities, silenced voices, and putting them in the mainstream. This whole politics of identity, which ushers in what I have elsewhere called a competition for tragedy. Who is the most oppressed of all? What balance of race, color, gender, ethnicity can make that person most oppressed, right? And all in the effort of bringing them into US classrooms for consumption of US students who will then feel in the neoliberal system, oh, I am an empathic subject, without any real progress happening. So I think that was the third aim that I broached in this essay, and I hope to continue this. And I find Fanon to be an amazing guide as I take this journey in thinking about race, racism, racial subjectification. Because coming from India, before coming from India, those kind of things existed for me only in books, in theory. But being in this country, and especially the last couple of years, the pandemic, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, has led me to realize after 18 years why race matters. But apart from that, being the father of a 9-year-old Indian American child and seeing him negotiate that identity at such an early age has really pushed me towards thinking about maybe I should try and figure out what's all this about. It's not just existing in the books, which in turn, my last comment would be, has also opened my eyes about my own complicity in my country as an upper class, upper caste person. What are the things I did not see? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, what a wonderful, stimulating, also difficult and painful conversation to have, you know, for me and many of the people in the discussion on our Heritage Day. So thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you, Gautam. It was very stimulating and I think very, very important.